It's great to be back with everybody. I'm afraid this is a little bit of a classroom lecture. I hope you'll bear with me. I hope you'll have interesting questions. I thought it would be particularly interesting in the context of the ICAA to pick up the theme of what we might call the eternal versus the relative. Around 1830, classicism goes through a series of fundamental challenges, and by no means, of course, will classical buildings in reference to the classical language of architecture, to antiquity, to the Italian Renaissance as incredible models of inspiration by any means disappear. Certainly with the rise of the Gothic revival and others, there will be stylistic competition. But more fundamental is a complete rethinking of the notion of imitation and the meaning of imitation in defining architectural style and defining the approach to an architectural problem in an ethos of architecture. And so for this reason, I've called the lecture tonight Romantic Revolt. Most people who know about Romanticism think of the 1820s. Architecture is a little bit late to join, but by 1830, a self-conscious Romanticism, which involves, we might say, an insistence that architecture is not based on eternal values that are true and to be adjudicated like law forever, but rather are relative, they're contingent, their relationship is to specific cultures and specific places. This is, of course, going to make classical heritage uniquely suited to 19th century nationalisms. Let's look just for a moment at this issue of imitation. I want to take it back into earlier centuries to set up our problem and take us to the 1830. Let me go back to the title slide in a moment. Some of you might be a little bit surprised to see the word avant garde in relationship to the third decade of the 19th century. That's something I'm going to explain in the course of the lecture. And if I manage to convince you that the avant garde is a concept of the 19th century and might be related to classicism, then everything has been achieved. All the rest is simply detail, although there will be a couple of heroes in tonight's lecture that I hope will intrigue you and will also inspire you to want to know more about them, and perhaps also to visit their buildings now that travel is again possible. So let's take up first something that's not in the title, this concept of imitation. Of course, the idea that the arts are based on imitation goes back to the earliest classical theory, but it is, in my view, given a new set of interpretations, first in the mid-18th century. We see it here in the famous book of the Abbot Loger, the Essay on Architecture, from its second edition of 1757, originally published in 1755, originally published in 1753. And there Loger insisted that architecture must imitate nature, not the outward forms of nature, but the inner logic. It's the beginning of what many have called structural rationalism, the idea that the classical column is not based on some notion that is abstract and outside of experience, but is rather an imitation of the fundamental constructive nature of architecture, that architecture should be based on structural laws, and that this goes back to the very notion of man's first creation, the primitive hut. Now, this had not always been the idea. We might look, for instance, here, such a rich Baroque interior. This is taken from a church in Bergamo in the north of Italy, but I've embedded in it in the upper left, I hope you can distinguish from all of the gilded ornament that there's another photograph superimposed on this. These are two versions of an attempt to depict what was called the sacred house of Loreto. This was believed to be the house in which Christ had been born, that had been transported from one place to another in a kind of Christian mythology. No one knew what this house looked like, so we have all sorts of interpretations of what it might be, here by Bramante, and here another example several centuries later in Bergamo. The point of this comparison is the imitation is of an idea, not of a form. The idea here that imitation can give rise to invention, to creativity, to different interpretations. Loger is going to try to move that into a very strict neoclassicism, an insistence that, let's say, unlike the columns here, which are paired and embedded, in the structure, used very sculpturally, subject to a great deal of ornament. That, let's say, with one of the key followers of Lauget's notion, the architect Soufflot, here in his famous Church of Sainte-Geneviève from the 1750s, so contemporary with the publication of Lauget's famous essay of 1753. This insistence on freestanding columns, which are shown to be performing their structural role. They are pure, they are unadorned with any fancy swagger or Baroque overcharged ornament. There's a clear separation of structure from infill, and excess ornament is, in a sense, pushed away from architecture completely. So this has often been defined as the beginning of that controversial term, neoclassical, in mid-18th century France. Equally, we could follow this movement in Germany, in England, even in the United States, with the founding of Washington, D.C., and the adoption of a Greco-Roman vocabulary for the architecture of the new American Republic. So this late 18th century neoclassicism, very well established. My point tonight, let's just go in for a moment to the interior of the Church of Sainte-Geneviève. In fact, a building of enormous innovation, even if it copied very precisely the Corinthian capitals of late Roman architecture, particularly as it was found at Baalbek in what is today the Lebanon. This building, in a sense, is a manifesto building of an idea of neoclassicism. My aim tonight is to show you that classical buildings after 1830 need to respond to a set of challenges in which the very fundamental idea of imitation is going to be brought into question, challenged, and the notion that Greek and Roman antiquity had provided models which were eternally true and to be followed over and over again was placed into question. Now, to do this, I'm going to look at two protagonists, both of whom, takes us back to the word revolt in the title, both of whom created something of a revolt, a real kerfuffle, a challenge to reigning doctrines, to reigning ethos, to reigning beliefs about architecture in precisely the same moment. This is 1828, so our key dates here are 1828 to 1830 for my argument this evening. One is Henri Labrouste. We're going to hear he is in a absolutely exquisite pencil drawing of him done in the 1850s by Ingres, that other master of line. We're going to see Labrouste himself as an extraordinary draftsman, but also an architect of a very challenging reinterpretation of the notion of classicism for both the post-French Revolutionary Romantic age, but also for a notion of an emerging industrial age. In 1828, he will stage a major confrontation with the French Academy of Fine Arts and its architectural members, and this will take place over the definition of the concept of imitation. So Labrouste is the first of our two romantic rebels, and he is going to be seen as the leader of a whole generation in France, and the really the linchpin of a group that self-styles themselves as the Romantics. If we have enough time at the end of the lecture, I might introduce you to a few of the others. Along the way, we will see at least one other, Félix Dubon, but we're taking Henri Labrouste as our point of entry for the position he takes in 1828, to which I'll return in a moment. Simultaneously, although this is not a question of friendship because these men did not know one another in 1828, I'm not sure if they ever met. They might have, because the figure on the screen now, Heinrich Hübsch, actually wonderful name if we were to translate it from German, it would probably be Henry Handsome. Not so sure that the portrait reinforces that, but Heinrich Hübsch was an architect in modern day Germany, but we are of course pre-unified Germany, so in the state of Baden, and in particular in its capital city of Karlsruhe, which has a particularly important relationship to the notion of neoclassicism, both in public and private buildings, but also even in town planning. And there in 1828, he published a manifesto that raised many of the same issues that were raised by Labrouste, which is to say, he challenged the notion that classicism was a set of rules even a strict grammar, but was rather a flexible system that could be related to time and place. And most importantly, he introduced the notion of development, the idea that a style might be developed, that it might change, and that we might project it into the future, not as something that's already recognizable, known based on antique examples, as much as one might learn from them, but rather that it was the role of the architect to evolve the new out of the old. This is perhaps one of the most fundamental Romantic ideas, and it takes us then to my first attempt to convince you that this definition, stolen off the internet, but I can find many other variants from Merriam-Webster to the like, is completely faulty in a certain sense, because as you can see, not only tells us that avant garde is either a noun or, it turns out, also possibly an adjective, artists with new ideas or methods, et cetera, artistically new, innovative, all of this is true, belonging to a group of writers whose work is innovative, experimental, or unconventional. And it tells us that its derivation is from the early 20th century, from French before the Garde. This is a completely faulty definition. There are many variants of it available. Not only is it not from before the Garde, it is, we have the word in English, it's from vanguard. It is a military term about those who go ahead and make sure that the coast is clear, help plan strategy in battle, and the like. So the avant-garde is the same word that comes into English as vanguard. Its transformation from a military term to the idea of it being a demeanor for an artist or an architect, by extension, who breaks with convention and sees into the future of what is required. In other words, a strategy for moving into the future, not simply moving into new territory, is coined in French and defined as a role for artists and architects at precisely this moment, between 1828 and 1830, in the circle of an extremely powerful, unconventional social thinker, Claude Henri de Saint-Simone. You see him here, actually died in 1825, but he is the first to suggest that there are professions in the post-revolutionary society that were preparing to take society towards its future form, which he thought would be more egalitarian, more legislative, many things that he thought would change, and in particular, kind of proto-industrialists thinking that the forces of production and of capital, of money moving around, were going to reshape the world. A very prescient figure, but he called for people to take leadership. That intellectuals, forces of capital would be the leaders towards the transformation of society. He started a whole movement of Saint-Simonianism that was to have a very major effect in the 19th century. In fact, many of the people who were involved in the transformation of Paris that we associate with Haussmann 30 years later came out of the Saint-Simonian movement. Most particularly here, one figure, you see him here in his tomb at Père Lachaise, but also a reprint of his treatise of 1830, dedicated to artists of the past and of the future of the fine arts, the doctrine of Saint-Simon. This is Barrault, a follower of Saint-Simon, who felt that Saint-Simon died before he could be quite specific about the role that would fall to artists and architects, musicians, writers, to lead the way, to form this vanguard, to be the avant-garde, and to understand not only the structure of the past, but that those laws of historical development that could be discerned and described in the past were laws that could be projected into the future. There was a trajectory underway. So classicism, along with this, was something that would be understood as on a trajectory, possible for development. So this idea too coming in, but along with it, this almost mythical endowment of the architect as someone who is preparing the future of the physical form, but also the social organization, the relationship we might have not only to buildings, but to one another in future society. So big charge, circa 1830. So to set this up, let's look at the extraordinary transformation of cities with monumental buildings based on a very literal fascination with the grandeurs of ancient Rome. Particularly, we need to understand this Romantic generation as the post-Napoleonic generation. With the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, not only his aspirations to make Paris into the new Rome, and we see it here in the Church of the Madeleine, which had been begun in the 18th century, but took the form that we see on the screen in a project that was commissioned by Napoleon to turn this unfinished 18th century church into a temple to the glory of the Grand Army of Napoleon. And this is the form that was built, although ultimately the building was not completed until long after the defeat of Napoleon, finally inaugurated around 1840. So this is a building that's finishing its construction right as this Romantic Revolt begins. We might say, with this fascination with the very large scale here, Roman Imperial Temple, or in this case, in Germany, here we're in the north of Bavaria, the Valhalla, a pet project of the King of Bavaria, Ludwig I, with his court architect, his official architect, Leo von Klenze, designing a Valhalla as a monument to German genius. Again, these nationalisms taking their form not so much through an evocation of the national past, but a kind of co-option of a grand, erudite classical language of architecture, but very literal reproductions of ancient temple forms, even for the creation of modern political ideologies or modern political mythologies, as in the case of the Valhalla. I just want to show you very quickly, Germany is a complicated case because whereas Paris, from very early on, is the center of France, and French life all looks to and emanates from Paris, Germany is a landscape of multiple courts and power centers, right into the present, of course. But three major architects appear in rival states who are masters of neoclassicism, which is, we might say, the doctrine that's going to come under attack. So I am working here with Hübsch and Labrouste. I'm showing you the way both cities and landscape were to be transformed into this neoclassical vision of the Roman or Greek temple here in Bavaria, but equally in Berlin, capital of Prussia, with the great court and state architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel. We'll return to both of these buildings momentarily. The Altes Museum on the Museum Island in Berlin of the late 1820s on the top, and then below it the State Theater or the Schauspielhaus of circa 1820, just finished by then, both in Berlin, making Berlin into what at the time was called the Athens on the Spree River. So another city that is absolutely branded, if you will, very 21st century word, but branded with the notion that this particular political organization, society, is the legitimate heir to Greco-Roman culture. And we could take that to a much less powerful, but absolutely architecturally protean capital, the capital of the state of Baden. This is in the far southwest of Germany, with its capital of Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe, a fascinating city because it had been founded ex novo as a capital in 1715 with a radial plan, with the palace, which you can just see here in the center of my image, at the center of a city plan that radiated out like the spokes of a wheel. But I don't want to talk to you about the formation of 18th century Karlsruhe, but rather look at the architect who would be building many of the buildings many decades later. This is Friedrich Weinbrenner. So Friedrich Weinbrenner is to Baden what Schinkel is to Prussia, or Leo von Klenze to Bavaria. Here we're looking at a cross-section of the court theater, which was built simultaneously as an extension to the palace itself, but also accessible to the public, a neoclassical temple. You can get some sense of that by these side porticos, but there was a great portico in front as well to enter through. And the opening scene for the opening night, when Weinbrenner's transformation of the center of Karlsruhe with neoclassical buildings for the church, for the town hall, the creation of an entire image of an ancient city as the modern capital of a German state, reforming everything from its legislation to its religious politics and the like. Now, all of these figures, Klenze, Schinkel, and Weinbrenner, were to be the teachers of the next generation. And we can find in Prussia, Bavaria, Baden, a representative of this Romantic Revolt. But I want to focus on are Heinrich Hübsch, who I've already introduced you to in portrait, because he is going to be the prized pupil of Weinbrenner. But as Weinbrenner is moving into his elderly years, cautiously, Heinrich Hübsch begins to think and to project and to develop a polemic that undermines almost everything that he's been taught. It undermines the notion that the truth of architecture is embodied forever in the 5 classical orders of architecture, that the imitation of the works of the ancients, as Winckelmann had said in the 18th century, was the only path to contemporary greatness, in favor not only of a study of Romanesque and even early Gothic architecture in Germany, therefore something that was born, as he would think, on native soil, but in particular to a notion that there might be some continuity across styles that would lead to a synthesis of different styles and a projection of architecture into the future as a synthetic interpretation of the path. Key to us to stick with this idea of imitation, which is the key issue that is debate here. This is a plate from Hübsch's first polemical treatise that was called On Greek Architecture, 1822, and he admires the Grecian temple as a pure structural expression in which beauty is derived from post-tendental construction. Everything that you see is performing a structural role, and he admires the same thing about the early Renaissance architecture, say in Florence, or Romanesque architecture, as he might find it in his native region of the Rhineland. But in between, this figure 5 here it is, he demonstrates that what the Romans did, so one took the history of classicism as it was handed from the Greeks to the Romans, he said that the Romans performed something which for him was practically a mortal sin. That is that they created what he called the first conventional lie in architecture, the untruth. Because as we move from this portico, where the columns are freestanding and they're holding up the pediment and the like, here the columns are actually part of the wall, and it is the arch that is doing the work. But the Romans have taken the visual language of Greek architecture and applied it to an architecture of a wall, of vaults, of arches, and the like. And they have rendered, therefore, in his view, classical architecture as a system of representation rather than a system of structure. And the column, particularly the half column or the pilaster, has become a lie. And so what he wants to achieve is an architecture in which the function of vaulting and of arches, much more efficient spanning means that the Romans had developed, is given its true expression. And this, he thinks, had first realized its first potential in early medieval architecture, in Romanesque architecture, but he considered that that had been cut short by the development of Gothic, and therefore the modern period could pick up this unfinished history and develop it further. So the key term that he says in relationship to this is none of these is a perfect model for imitation for today, but rather we must understand the dynamic. We must reject the conventional lie of the applied column, but we must understand the structural evolution of architecture and move forward with what he calls the developmental capacities and Entwicklungsfähig in German of the early Romanesque. All of this comes to a head in a manifesto, really, and the idea that the Avant Garde is associated with manifestos is something that we think in relationship to the futurists or to Le Corbusier in the 1920s. But I think that this 1828 publication of Hübsch, there you see his portrait here, a very pixelated view of the modern edition of the pamphlet that he published called In welchem Stil sollen wir bauen? In what style should we build? Now, this is a text that is cited by many authors who have never read it, and they think that it is a text about confusion, and it's the beginning of eclecticism, and Hübsch can't make up his mind. Should we do Gothic? Should we do Romanesque? Should we do Tuscan Renaissance? Should we do pure ancient Greek? The title page says, In what style should we build? Answered by Heinrich Hübsch. It is a programmatic manifesto calling for what he calls the round-arched style as a development out of that idea that he'd already been working with towards the idea that the round arch as a structural form could generate the solution to all of the building types, all of the demands of modern society, from the church to the school building, to a theater, to a administrative tax quarters and the like. Now, the great manifesto building that he builds is a very simple one programmatically. It is what's called in German a Trinkhalle. It's basically, we're here in the larger photograph. We're going to contrast it in a moment with the little postage stamp photograph up here. Both of them are buildings that are built in the spa towns of Baden. Baden has a lot of mineral waters, perhaps the most famous in the town of Baden-Baden, that very redundantly titled town. And in Baden-Baden, where the rich of Europe came to cultivate and cure their ailments, they would take these sometimes pugnacious mineral waters. And the problem with these waters, when they appear, particularly here, there's a little fountain at the center where it's coming out of the earth, is that they're boiling hot. So you get them in a cup. If any of you have been there, you know you walk back and forth, up and down. It's the case in many of these spa towns, waiting for the water to achieve a temperature. You might even be in your hospital gown, but you can also socialize with others who are there to take the waters. And so this building is not a very demanding in terms of what it has to solve, but it therefore gave Hübsch the possibility of making the building a manifesto for the possibility of a new style of architecture, the seedbed, if you will, of something that is developmentable. And so here we have the ancient Greek stoa form, this series of colonnades, but all of these columns are carrying something, but in this case, they're not carrying a lintel, as in Greek architecture, they're carrying a segmental arch, the most efficient way of spanning a large space. And so this willing combination of column and segmental arch is for Hübsch the beginning of a whole new episode in modern architecture. We'll see in a moment, he even uses a great deal of metal. This is a building done a few years earlier nearby in Baden-Baden by his teacher Weinbrenner. And this is a stucco addition to a building where this portico in pure Roman style actually is not performing structurally what it appears to be doing. All of the structure behind is hidden. For this, Hübsch considers is false. This, in a sense, is his retort to his teacher. Now, one other key thing that's happened here is all of Weinbrenner's buildings, which are built of brick, are stuccoed over to be white and pure and make them appear as though they were built from Grecian marble, whereas Hübsch says, no, in Germany, we build from very small materials. We don't have marble like in the Pentelic marble of Greece. We have brick. We have smaller materials. They lend themselves to arches and vaults and voussoirs and the like. Let's express that. Let's show off the brick. Let's find a language for the very materials out of which the building is made, rather than the falseness of stuccoing over an image of Greek architecture. So this was for him, this building, a kind of manifesto of a notion of truth in architecture. This was the title slide while you were waiting for people to filter in this beautiful evening light while we're going to get our sulfurous waters and do this programmatic display of the mythology of mineral waters. But most importantly, I want you to see how this great open arcade, lifted up as a place for looking over the landscape while you're doing that, is a manifesto about the elements of a new system of architecture that Hübsch will take to other buildings. And look at the way he exposes within it the iron spanning elements, so the different materials, whether they be tile, brick, terracotta, granite, or structural iron, are all given their expression in this richly polychromatic, this coloristic architecture that doesn't seek to hide everything under a neoclassical uniformity of white stucco. So there's that radial plan of Karlsruhe. I hope it intrigues you enough that you want to explore the history of this amazing German city. It's still very readable today. It was very badly bombed in the Second World War. But Weinbrenner had defined an architecture of stucco neoclassicism as the language for this entire town to fill out the 1715 radial plan. Into it, one last building for the administration, changing administration, in the 1830s is going to be added by his pupil, Hübsch. Weinbrenner, by this point, dies in 1825, so he never sees this courtyard administration building for the Tax and Finance Ministry. Not a very sexy program. Those of you who took an extension in April are probably thinking about taxes right now. If you were a citizen of Baden, this is where they would be going. And you can see in this building, which follows the curvature of this radial plan, again, a language of brick, of arches, and the like for a kind of functionalist expression of the round-arched style. Or here in the city gates, look at this contrast between Hübsch and the city gates and one of the last buildings of Weinbrenner there, which is a stucco building with these applied pilasters, what for Hübsch were conventional lies. And he was to push this idea of development, particularly in church architecture. He was born a Protestant, but converted to Catholicism in the 1840s, I think late 1840s. This is a church right around the time of that conversion, still standing today in the Karlsruhe suburb of Bulak, dedicated to St. Cyrian. But the most important thing here is the development of that segmental arch and these segmental vaults that make this building a very wide open structural cage through the concept of structural development. Let's just, in closing with Hübsch, and then we're going to switch to France for the rest of our time together this evening, just look at some contrasts of program. Here is the art museum that Hübsch was able to build. Again, exposed materials, polychromatic, everything that you see is performing a structural role and evolving the style towards a modern classicism that can accommodate all of the steps through which classicism has evolved. There you see an engraving of it, very well restored after the Second World War. Just again, a few weeks ago, the subject of a competition for yet another extension. So today, this is the head building of a complex series of buildings if you go to see the art collections in Karlsruhe. But interesting to compare it, there you see a 19th century view of it, with the neoclassical example by Schinkel. So if Schinkel was willing to add a stoa in front, almost like a billboard in front of a building that's doing something completely different, Hübsch insists that we can read all of the types of spaces, vaulted spaces behind these tripartite windows, a bigger room here at the center, that we can read the program in the exterior form of the building, and that the building no longer bears any reference whatsoever to a specific classical example. We can go to Greece and find the form of the stoa. It's largely a reconstruction by the American archaeologists in the 20th century, but nonetheless, the idea of the Greek stoa was very well known, and this is what Schinkel is not only imitating, but evoking as an idea, whereas Hübsch wants to develop something which is without precedent in the classical world, but to his mind is a development, an evolution, a modernization of the inherent possibilities of classicism without a need to negate its later histories. So likewise, just to complete, this building is inadequate as a theater attached to the palace. It will fall to Hübsch to design a new theater. This is not his, this is Carl Friedrich Schinkel. So again, you see a classical temple front on front of a building that's doing actually something quite different, as opposed to, let's say, Heinrich Hübsch, who develops the vaulted forms of his interior architecture of this fireproof brick building into a portico of his segmental arch type. So here is the manifesto of the Spa Trinkhalle in Baden-Baden of a few years earlier, being developed into one of the most complex building projects that anyone would have in the 19th century, how to get the various forms of the theater into a harmonious urban ensemble. The building lost in the Second World War, so there's a photograph of how it appeared. And finally, he builds the School of Architecture itself. What could be more programmatic if you have an ideology of architecture than to build the building for a School of Architecture? The building itself is a statement. It is a textbook, a built textbook for the students who will study there. And again, a building completely derived from its vaulted forms, brought out to the facade, where we have these figures of Erwin von Steinbach, the Gothic architect, and Kepler, the geometrician, talking about architecture as an art and a science, but manifesting itself in this rich exposition of both the structural principles and the true materials out of which this building, unstuccoed building in stuccoed Weinbrenner's Karlsruhe, would announced that Karlsruhe wanted to be a center of the architecture developed and derived from this Romantic Revolt. It's a building that is completed in the late 1840s, so 20 years after the Romantic Manifesto. And in the end, Schinkel himself, I made him a little bit into the whipping boy, or made him a kind of caricature of himself. His school of architecture in Berlin was equally challenging and showed the extent to which he himself had evolved towards this position by the end of his life, as this building was completed shortly before Schinkel's death in 1841. In fact, Schinkel occupied an apartment in this level, the Building Academy in Berlin, and there it is in the 19th century photograph, dynamited by the East Germans in 1961. So let's take another 20, 25 minutes or so to look at the situation in France, where the exact contemporary of Heinrich Hübsch, remember we have that key date of 1828, which brings us Heinrich Hübsch's In What Style Should We Build? It brings us the transformation of the word avant garde from being a military strategy to being an artistic demeanor. It is also the year in which Henri Labrouste stages a fight with his professors and with the French Academy of Fine Arts over the very meaning of classical antiquity, and particular Greek antiquity, for modern culture, for modern architecture, for an architecture, he would say, that is based on historical evolution, on change of relative values, rather than the notion of the imitation of classical architecture as the embodiment of eternal truths that are immutable. So for him and his entire generation, the legacy of Napoleonic urbanism was a kind of caricature. How could the same Roman imperial temple be on one side of the Seine, the Church of the Madeleine, an embodiment of Catholicism, the state religion of France, although this was being challenged after 1830 by the notion that the state would equally accommodate all religions, even Islam, with the conquest of Algeria later in the 1830s. There's the interior. You see, there's a kind of contradiction between the imperial Roman interior and then this vaulted exterior and this vaulted interior. But facing it on the left bank of the Seine, the National Assembly, the lower house of the legislature, being likewise behind a huge Corinthian temple portico, and yet this was a secular building. So what in the world did it mean if everything, including, I could have also put here the stock exchange, the Bourse, which Victor Hugo said was the third chapter that had been begun in this novel, where every chapter was the identical same Corinthian principle. What did it mean if all public buildings looked exactly the same? The city was illegible. It was a kind of declaration of a universal kneel down and pray to a very literal archaeological neoclassicism. This was to be continued right into the 1820s, 30s, 40s with the long construction of this type of Stoa colonnade building, the Palace of Justice in Lyon, by one of Labrouste's teachers, Louis-Pierre Baltard. This is not Baltard that you know of the Central Markets, but rather his father, very important teacher at the French Academy and one of Labrouste's teachers. And likewise, the church building program that began with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy after 1815 and the increase in population in Paris and expansion that required the construction of a great number of parish churches, most of them designed by this architect who was considered by the younger Turks, who were going to be the Romantic rebels, to be a kind of old guard, an old fuddy-duddy, because all of his churches, they thought, looked the same, Saint-Denis du Saint-Sacrement, and a series of others around Paris, which are still standing, all look like one variation on another. The grandest of all, by Labrouste's most immediate teacher, Lebas, was the Church of Notre-Dame de Lorette, and it was considered to be the most accomplished church and the model that could be used for others to come. As you can see, it took over the temple front of a temple that was on Italian soil. It's actually the temple at Cori, which had been drawn by Piranesi and many others, that is adapted for its verticality to this site at what was then the northern edge of Paris, and today's 9th arrondissement, completed right around the time that Labrouste begins to make his revolt. And this was a limited invited competition, and you can see so many variants on precisely the same theme, all of them to be fronted, whoever was chosen, by some kind of temple front portico. The interior was an evocation of the transformation of the early Christian basilica into the Italian Renaissance. It looks more like a kind of neoclassicized version of, say, Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And this was really considered the template for things to come. It is against this background that a group begins to agitate. Labrouste was not alone. Probably the first who's going to bring in a very important challenge to the accepted ideas of Greek and Roman antiquity as model is this German immigrant architect, Jacques Ignace Hittorf, who was born in Cologne during the period when it was occupied by the French, and therefore he adopted French nationality, left his native Cologne and set up shop in France. It's a very interesting go-between. He actually knew Heinrich Hübsch, but also, of course, Labrouste. I'm bringing him in because he brings in another important theme for us this evening, which is the paradoxical way in which the challenge to the neoclassical orthodoxy will take place through archaeological study and saying, we love Greek architecture as much as you do, but we've been to see it and you got it all wrong. This is actually not what Greek architecture is about. And this begins with the whole controversy over whether or not the Greek temples were colored, were painted, had perhaps stucco applied to them. And this was very challenging to the older generation who thought that classical antiquity was something of pure whiteness and the pure expression of noble materials, in particular marble. The idea that the Greeks would have added layers of stucco and color to the temples for all sorts of reasons. One, of course, all of these fine measurements that had been taken by traveling architects to establish the perfect proportions of the orders would be completely thrown off if there were several centimeters of stucco and applied paint. All of those measurements went out the window. And so where was this 2.5 century long debate on what were the perfect proportions of the classical orders if this additional layer had to be taken into account? And moreover, the idea that the Greeks would simply be so kitsch as to have had technicolor temples, in a certain sense, that the temple that everyone so admired, when if they could make the voyage to Greece, or more likely they saw Greek temples in Sicily or south of Naples at Paestum, much more accessible, that these, in fact, were simply the scaffolding for painting ideas about Greek mythology, painted sculptures and the like. And so when Hittorf published his findings on the polychromatic scheme of classical temples, it was a huge controversy. He even tried to embody it in his variant on the neoclassical church. This is the Church of Saint-Vincent de Paul, near the Gare du Nord in Paris. And as you can see, under the portico, here's a bad 19th century engraving, but here is a detail of just the portico part. He wanted to use, and they've just been put back, it's spectacular. If you can go to Paris, they've been reinstalled in the last few years. These encaustic, this is volcanic stone from the Auvergne, encaustic painted panels that tell the story of Genesis. They had been removed, it was often said, because people were opposed to the idea of this coloristic temple. They were actually removed because the nudity of Adam and Eve had not only worried them in the Garden of Eden, but it worried the Bishop of Paris, who demanded that they be removed. In any case, Hittorf is extremely important for us for bringing this notion that the Greek temples were colored. Now, this took more than simply an aesthetic notion or rattling the accepted ideas of proportions. It led also to the notion that the temple was a place where Greeks simply painted on their belief system, their ideas, and that therefore the temples were directly related to Greek mythology, to Greek lifestyle. In other words, putting them almost anthropologically, let's say, back into the past, rather than in some notion of an eternal standard of beauty. So these wonderful plates made possible by the new innovations of lithography, and then taken into the interior of this spectacular church, which has been recently restored, Saint-Vincent de Paul. There's a bad black and white photograph of it. Now, this is the very controversy that Henri Labrouste will step into in 1828. And this will take the form when he, who having studied but now rejecting this literal notion of neoclassicism of the teachers Baltard and the like of Lebas. I showed this again, this law court, because Labrouste won the Grand Prix, and with it the 5-year scholarship, if you will, to be a resident at the French Academy in Rome and to perfect his knowledge of classicism with this, a project for a law court. And you can see he's a very good student at that point with his classical portico. And he goes off to Rome, having been won the prize in 1824, and he begins the study of classical architecture by studying first the orders, and then, but then these are some of the drawings that we exhibited in MOMA in 2013, and they are spectacular drawings. He begins to pay attention in a way that is looking forward to Heinrich Hübsch, to all of the material differences, to the structural expression, and he begins to see classical architecture in a much more complex way, not as an abstract embodiment of perfect proportions, but actually as a material object and as something that recorded the daily life of the society. And look at this study of the Colosseum, and here he is studying, like Hübsch, the nature of Roman construction, stripping away the conventional lies to show what vaulted architecture, arcuated architecture would generate as form. Studying also the cross currents of civilizations in Sicily. This is a study of the Islamic influenced, Byzantine-influenced roof structure of the cathedral at Monreale near Palermo. But all comes to a head when he sends in the 4th year assignment. In the 4th year of the scholarship, the students were meant to send back a full restoration of an ancient building in ruins. They were to take everything that they knew about classical architecture and show that they could, almost as though you had found some bones of a dinosaur, you could put the whole thing back together because you knew the eternal laws of classicism. He chose the complex group of temples, Greek Doric temples at Paestum, south of Naples on the south coast in Campania. And here are some of his exquisite watercolor drawings showing the Greek Doric. This is a very controversial argument that he put forth. So, Temple of Neptune. And then here the key controversy took place over this, sometimes called Temple C, I think, in which Labrouste restored this building with this funny pointed roof, which there's no evidence for the way the roof was, but he tried to derive it from the structure. But most importantly, in this temple, here we have it here in his cross section, what is characteristic of it and curious is that the center of the temple, rather than being a boxy open cella defined by walls, is bisected by a central row of columns. And he made the two arguments that were very controversial. One, he argued that the Doric that was more squat, had less refined proportions, was not the earliest of the temples, as had always been argued, because it had always been argued that these Greek colonists arrived on the south coast of Italy, and gradually they relived civilization until they got to the most refined proportions, and that the most elegant proportions of the group of temples was by definition the latest, because that was the closest to the classical ideal. Labrouste turned the whole thing around and he said, no, the one that's the most refined is them doing what they did in Athens, but gradually as they lived in a new situation, so here we are in romantic relativism, they adapted to a new society, they created a new society in a new climate, in a new situation, and gradually their own beliefs and their own organization of their town and of their way of dealing with the territory, everything, they developed their own culture. And with that, they developed a different set of proportions. He's completely wrong, actually, but you can see this will to create the notion that truths are not eternal, but they are adapted to specific situations, local materials, local beliefs, and that they live in harmony with their society. And for that reason, he even reconstructed what there is absolutely no evidence for, all of these ornaments here. Now this is, we do nothing else, this is an absolutely key part of it. Here's his perspective of it, in which he puts all these swords up, because he says that what happened is that the temple served as a place to celebrate victories. this was not a temple at all. He said it was a basilica. How could it be a temple if it had a central row of columns? You couldn't move through an axis to a cult figure, but rather this was a place for civic assembly. And when they had something to celebrate, they decorated the temple. They painted it, they put graffiti on it, they hung up their swords, they hung up their shields, and out of this hanging up of shields, the elements of architecture, those patera, those various forms that we think of classicism as simply being stylistic representations, he said all derive from making permanent ephemeral practices of celebration. He was also looking to Etruscan tombs that they were discovering, and look here at this imaginary reconstruction of the upper town of Agrigento, how he imagines that the entrance to the city has been ornamented with these elements that had been brought there on parading. So he begins to become fascinated, and this is one of the key points for this evening, with the relationship of architecture to its specific society. He says even that the language of architecture, for one, is related to structure and materials, but for another is related to the way that societies use their buildings, and as they use them for momentary occasions, they create the elements of decoration so that architecture becomes, particularly temples, city gates, and the like, ceremonious. This is his brother, who was there at the same time, Henri Labrouste, who wins the Grand Prix a few years later, and he reconstructs the Temple of Cori. This is the temple that had served as the basis for Lebas' Church of Notre-Dame de Lorette, but he puts all of these decorations, these swags and the like that are hanging there. You can see these hanging swags, and these hanging swags of maybe the feast day for the god there become an absolute leitmotif for the group. And then he says, look at the bottom of Trajan's column. There's a swag, but that has now been rendered in bronze, because gradually these ceremonial usages became the language of architecture. So the language of classical architecture for him is not an abstract set of proportions. It is the permanent embodiment of sets of social practices that tie these things to Rome. And so when he's coming back to France the next year for his final project, he designs a little bridge linking Italy on this side and France on that side. And because it's a passage between two cultures, he gives it these little swags. And then here's the bridge in the south of France. It was his inspiration. And then when he is chosen to design all of the decor for the return of Napoleon's remains to Italy, a big political decision in 1840, he designs this barge that brings the ashes of Napoleon down the Seine to Paris. And you'll see that it too is hung with these swags. And then here is the temple that is erected with swags once again for the arrival of the ashes in Paris, and Labrouste designs this great carriage, and it too is covered with swags, which ultimately are to be taken up in the permanent forms of the street lighting, and the idea, even the modern gas lamp can be a celebration of street practices and the like, that civic life in the 19th century might, here in cast iron and the like, begin to generate the forms of a new architecture. So this dynamic of the relationship between ephemeral practices, those things that bring a society together, and the creation of its forms of architecture are perhaps the most vibrant romantic challenge to neoclassical doctrine that Labrouste brings. Even takes it into the first sustained magazine on architecture, César Dalí's General Review of Architecture and Public Works. And finally, we'll conclude with this building. I see the hour is late. I have many other examples. I could give you the Romantic Rebellion 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0, but for tonight, for 1.0, we're going to end in one of the masterpieces of 19th century architecture that comes absolutely out of this Romantic revolt, out of this configuration of challenging ideas, in which the building that you're looking at, I think, can no longer be called neoclassical, although it certainly is related in some way to the heritage of classical antiquity, and in particular, as you've seen, Henri Labrouste's intensive 5-year study of it directly in Rome. This is the commission he receives in 1838, so exactly a decade after his 1828 confrontation with the Academy, who were horrified by his interpretation of Paestum, which flew in the face of everything that they had published and said about it, and they didn't understand why he restored things that weren't there, why he put graffiti there, why he insisted that the primitive was the most developed. It was a very, it's one level arcane, but also very fundamental generational dispute. This is the building in which he embodies all of his ideas. If you will, this is to his work what the Trinkhalle, the spa building, was to Heinrich Hübsch's, and in many ways a much more complex and compelling building, because if the Trinkhalle is largely remembered only by architectural historians, this is a building that has inspired architects over and over again up to the present day. As a very early photograph, this is a 19th century photograph, one of the first photographs ever of a modern building as opposed to a medieval or an ancient remain, that shows the building as it spans the northern edge of the square of the Pantheon, the highest point on Paris's left bank. Now, I have quickly, just to show you where Labrouste worked before he came to this building. He was the on-site architect for his friend Félix Dubon. Dubon, it's D-U-B-A-N, if anyone's taking notes. Dubon was had been in Rome already when Labrouste arrived. He was the Grand Prix winner of the year before, and he was given the commission to do nothing less than to transform the various buildings that formed the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of the Fine Arts. So once again, to design an architecture school on the left bank, and his major addition is this courtyard and the building of the so-called Bâtiment des Études, the building of studies, that was the center of the composition. It was, there you see it on this 1840 map, it was a reworking of the inherited monastery of the Petits Augustins, which had been the first French architecture and sculpture museum. There, I'm going to skip ahead because I see the hour's getting late, but had been brought together there many things in the revolution there was a repository for elements that had been taken from churches with the brief abolition of the church, and from aristocratic houses with the abolition of titles of nobility, and the dismantling of many chateaux and the like. Key to this is this element, which is taken from the late Gothic, early Renaissance chateau of Gaillon in Normandy, this fragment which had been brought there under the Revolution, and which, I'll skip right past that, and here's the first study by the predecessor architect for a palace of studies to be based on Italian Renaissance principles, but that will be rebuilt, let's move quickly ahead, and redesigned by Dubon as a much more complex historical argument, into which, here it is as it's been denuded today, and the whole controversy, we're interested in this building which is inserted, the whole controversy takes place over whether these historical fragments that were left over from the Museum of French Monuments, which had been abolished in 1815, and the architectural theorist, a member of the Academy, Cantrell-Quincy, said we have to get rid of these Gothic and early Renaissance, very hybrid fragments, because they're very bad examples for our students of architecture. They might copy them, and there's so much different information. Maybe eclecticism will emerge, but least of all, we do not want a Gothic revival. Our students will begin to copy these, and these are absolutely examples of bad taste. What you mustn't do, they must learn perfect classicism. Dubon answers, no, I want these there, and I want the students to understand how there is an evolution of form. For instance, that this Renaissance facade by Philibert Delorme, Chateau of Annette, and this Gothic facade that he was never able to put there were synthesized to create out of classicism and the medieval a French style of classicism, which was different from Italian classicism and was the starting point, not only for many centuries of French creation, but for a rebooting of French architecture in the present. And he wanted his building to be seen through the screen of that as the development, the further refinement, as though he had learned all of the lessons from the past and was able to synthesize them into this modern building. So that was the key lesson here, the École des Beaux-Arts. I'm going to skip over it because it's a very complex set of buildings, but there we can see some of our friends, Lebas and Charles Percier, get into the building, and then the students are exposed to a kind of living museum in which all of the centuries speak to one another, and finally, throw out from this mural by Delaroche the prizes. In fact, I think you can just see there in the center, this is divided in two, this figure, she's cut off, is throwing out a laurel wreath to the winner of the prizes. So let's go back in conclusion to where we began. We began with this church, became the Pantheon under the French Revolution by Soufflot. It was the embodiment of that idea of neoclassical imitation with which we began. And as luck would have it, the assignment to Labrouste is to design a library for, so this, our church is right here at the edge of my slide, and this library forms the northern edge of the square. So the library is just slipped over there in the square into which this building stands as a freestanding object, but the northern edge had never been defined, and Labrouste is going to design the library. Both the church and the library are both derived from the former monastery of Sainte-Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris. You could say that if Soufflot, in the middle of the 18th century, had taken the church out and made it into a freestanding monument, but also an absolute embodiment of 18th century neoclassical ideas, the library, which had also been in that monastery, will be taken out and given the form of a modern library as not only a freestanding monument, but also something that defers as a background building to the church. So Sainte-Geneviève, in a certain sense, its parts taken apart to become actors on the urban stage. There you see it as the background building, deliberately eschewing any freestanding columns in favor of this very understated arcade. This is also by Soufflot, by the way. This is the School of Law. They're part of this 18th century composition. And Labrouste doesn't imitate what's already there. He finds a 19th century addition in which these lessons are synthesized with many others to create this absolutely extraordinary building, the first public library in France, with a very solid ground floor, and then above it, one great reading room that fills the entire upper floor as one great volume. And he is allowing us to read that program. These are book stacks below, closed. This is a great reading room that will enter. And because, of course, this is a monument of civic purpose, he gives it these garlands. They've come back, a kind of ceremony creating the forms of the new building. All of his study is going to go into it. Look at this study he's made of a tomb near Agrigento, the way that classical masonry steps back and expresses its different weight forms. The moldings actually have a rational reason, and he takes that up in the same way as he reworks his masonry at the entrance to the building. Let me, in conclusion, take you into this absolutely extraordinary building. It has a very important role for a modern material of iron. How would iron enter into an architecture that was based on classical antiquity? How could one simultaneously adopt the lessons of antiquity and develop them, this key romantic concept, develop them to such an extent that they could accommodate and take advantage of a material that had only been used in the most limited form in antiquity, iron, and then always in sort of hidden form to create this great interior. We can read the entire interior. In fact, in a certain sense, this building, which is dedicated to reading, we can also read the nature of the interior divisions. The bookcases are here, and there they are with the titles, the names of the authors on the back of the infill, this great arcade of the vaults. Everything about the interior is literally transcribed with this romantic notion of truth and the evolution of architectural forms from structure of this great reading room. There is one of the great spaces of the 19th century with the incorporation now of this cast iron form. And as you can see, the willingness to say proportions are not going to, we're not going to make classical columns that follow the proportions of the way the ancients did stone, because iron operates in a completely different way. So these very, very attenuated columns, which one wonders, are they holding up this great double-barreled ceiling, or are they holding it down, almost tying this very almost ballooning, voluminous form there. And so this iron form, we can actually read the ironwork in the floor as it cuts through, and there we have it, as it cuts through, and these are treated as the stamps that are also the stamps in every one of the library books, but they show you the pinning of this iron structure at the heart of it. We can read that both here and there at the same time as we can read the form of the vaults of this building that was designed basically as an enormous assembly room for people to read together. And in Labrouste's notion, coming out of the Saint-Simonian notion that the architect of the industrial present would give rise to new civic rituals of new ways of coming together, no longer the ancient temple, not the medieval church, but rather the civic building of inquiry into rational thought with its authors ordered in chronological rather than alphabetical order as the progress of knowledge. All of that would be embodied in a building that was a container, a civic celebration of reading, of printing, of the exchange of knowledge right at the heart of the university quarter. So that, let's go into it, this incredible celebration as we move through this garden with figures of great thinkers, and then up the staircase, which is treated almost like a civic bridge that we're going to cross into to emerge into this extraordinary reading room, all of which is calculated to allow light on all four sides to reflect off that white ceiling and make this building the great place for civic assembly of modern readers in the secular society that Saint-Simon imagined would emerge from the laws of historical evolution. So this is a building that was dedicated both to synthesizing the past, following it through the laws of its evolution, and helping to push it as an avant-garde architect towards the form of the future, with all of the respect, of course, for the past, embodied in both the architectural ideas of the building, but of course also in all of the books contained there. So we might, in looking at this extraordinary form of the reading room, subdivided down the middle by a row of very thin cast iron columns supporting these beautiful curved trusses, with which I'll end in just a second. Here's Labrouste's cross-section of it. You can see how the books literally become the ornament of the architecture, almost as though their ephemeral use is also generating the form of the building. But this is a form which for him celebrates all sorts of things. It celebrates, do I have it? No. Well, you remember, of course, Paestum. It celebrates the basilica, the civic element of the classic temple bisected down the middle. It celebrates the refectory of the Gothic church of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, which his friend Vaudoyer had just converted into a library for the Conservatory of Arts and Techniques. But this was the room in which the monks read, not the church, but the room of reading. And it had a Republican aspect in that one of the earliest forms for the Estates General, the emergence, the slow emergence in the Middle Ages of what became by the Revolution, the idea of how voices from different parts of society might come together in this room, which was for public assembly in the chateau at Blois, which had just been redecorated in polychromatic form by Dubon of the École des Beaux-Arts. So here we have three of the great romantic rebels who took their departure from Labrouste's rebellion in 1828. Labrouste himself, Vaudoyer restoring here, Dubon restoring there, transforming these spaces. But this is a genealogy of the bisected room as a space of communal assembly that had made its way from antiquity through the Middle Ages into, via the reflection here, Boulay, this was on Labrouste's drawing table the whole time, to Labrouste's studies, first with a double pitched roof, and then finally this great reading room that is the modern evolution, with its embrace of iron as the material that is most changing the possibilities and the proportions of modern architecture for a architecture of a romantic rebellion that is at once an evolution of classicism, but also a fundamental calling into question of the idea of literal imitation as a point of departure for contemporary architecture. So I will end there. As you can hear from my rushing voice, there's so many other things I would have liked to have told you, but I hope that gives you an overview, and maybe I have won you over to my argument that around 1830, there was a complete rethinking of the nature of imitation at the heart of classical architecture.
At the time, that Hübsch and Labrouste had presented these ideas, do you have a sense of how they were received? Were these ideas that were embraced by the public at the time, or were they highly criticized?
Well, Labrouste, I don't know if I sufficiently sketched a portrait of, maybe it was a tempest in a teapot, but of the controversy within the French Academy. So Labrouste had been sent at the expense of the Academy, which is of course a state organization, to the Villa Medici, to the French Academy in Rome. So, you know, who wouldn't want a 5-year all expenses paid trip to Rome to refine your skills, but you had to send back those drawings as your proof that you were at work and not simply going to Roman cafes. In fact, they actually found Rome intensely boring. And the night they didn't quite know what to do, but that's a whole nother story. But when those drawings came back, the Academy thought for a moment to reject them. They said, these are not possible, this is inaccurate, he is challenging us. First of all, why has he taken this provincial Greek monument when he could have done some of the splendors of Rome? These are rather primitive Doric buildings, and moreover, he's turned what we have accepted as the story on its head. They completely understood what he was up to, and they fought back. And so there was a controversy that went on for quite a number of months that was so violent within the, let's say, the artistic community, and taken up in the expanding artistic press, where many of the battles of Romanticism and the other arts were also being fought, that it made Labrouste overnight a kind of hero for the younger generation. So he's also, to the extent that many students and the younger students at the École des Beaux-Arts demanded that he form a teaching studio, and they sort of paraded him through the streets, and he opened up a studio. And many left the studios where they were with older professors to work with Labrouste. And it has been documented, in fact, that of Labrouste's students, almost not a single one ever won a prize. It was as though Labrouste, for this challenge to academic orthodoxy, was forever after to be punished in a certain way. But at the same time, his buildings were very, very widely admired, and he, as I said, became something of a hero to the younger generation. And to such an extent that 50 years after it happened, when those drawings of Paestum were exhibited as some of the finest works of French architectural drawing at a World's Fair, Viollet-le-Duc, who was admired Labrouste enormously, even though he had a very different position, said, oh, here are those big sheets of drawing, or what were called elephant folio sheets, huge drawings, the Paestum drawings. He said they were quite simply a revolution on some sheets of paper at the time. And this he's writing 50 years after it happened, so people remembered it very, very much. Hübsch also became his text. It was only printed in a small number of copies, but it was given out to people who had assembled for an annual celebration of the birthday of Albrecht Dürer in Nuremberg, and it was sort of distributed there, and it became something of a architectural treatise to take up the ideas that Romantic artists were developing in painting and sculpture. It too caused an enormous amount of theoretic debate in German, so in what is today Germany and in Austria. And a number of years ago, the title page that I showed you was actually from a modern edition that brings together Hübsch's 1828 text and all of the texts for the next 20 years that responded to it. So it became it started a swell of thinking. I saw in the chat, somebody wanted to know what Hübsch would call his architectural style, and he would call it the Rundbogenstil. Very complicated German word, it sounds, but it simply means round arch style. And so he thought of the round arch as something that would generate the architecture of the future. And he preferred, rather than say Romanesque revival or neo-Romanesque or neo-early Renaissance, to say that he wanted to create a round arch style for modernity. So did that answer your question? maybe a little too long-winded.
Beautifully, absolutely. I think it answered a number of the questions that were out there. One person asks, he says he's recently read Colin Rowe's essay on modernism in modern architecture, in which he focuses on the same historical period. In it, he talks about the role that abstraction and a focus on sensation played in the evolution of architecture. Can you speak to this in the context of your lecture? Does that mean anything to you? Are you able to?
Yeah, I think so. I wish that I could invite whoever submitted that really interesting question to get. We would have a seminar on it. We would reread that text and we would reread it in relationship to this. I don't really think of Rowe as talking about these specific buildings, but I do think, as you can see, an idea of abstraction is partly at play here, a kind of abstracting of, a refusal of ornament that is not related to some social purpose. Ornament is no longer just ornament. It comes from social use. Now, it's not abstraction as we would think of it in 20th century terms. Yeah, I mean, there's a partial answer to that question. I would love to put together. That's really a great topic for an intensive seminar session with a group of readings brought together, and to ask in the end, what is Colin Rowe's take on the 19th century?
Well, it's a good sign when we get good questions from our audience members. So thank you, whoever asked that question. We had another question, which is somewhat of a stretch. Do you see any parallels between the work of Augustus Pugin in relation to Labrouste and Hübsch?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, years ago, Neil Levine wrote an essay in which he put these three figures together. So and I think it's a very perceptive question. So certainly we don't think of Pugin in this regard because Pugin absolutely rejects classicism and the forms, and is, a convert both to Catholicism and to the Gothic, and goes so crazy about the Gothic that it said towards the end of his life that he wouldn't even eat his pudding if it wasn't in an ogival form. So we tend to think of Pugin as being in a completely different place because of this Gothic revival, what's the word I want, kind of fanaticism. But Pugin is absolutely a descendant of the French structural rationalist tradition, and many of his arguments about truth, etc. If you can read Pugin, if you without the illustrations, and he could be describing Heinrich Hübsch. The idea of rejecting conventional lies, the search for an architecture that derives from structure, all of this is something that is shared by Pugin. He just comes to a different conclusion about what it means for current practice. I think that probably later on, Hübsch himself, I don't think they ever met, but Hübsch himself later converts to Catholicism, and he takes up a position that has much more to do with the early Christians. So he reaches a different stylistic conclusion, but he follows a very parallel track to Pugin. So I would say, unlike Labrouste, Pugin and Hübsch are figures for whom modern religious belief plays a very key role, whereas we don't really know the specific religious beliefs of Labrouste, but he's very close to this Simonian idea of a new Christianity. But that new Christianity is one that is based on the Auguste Comte's notion of positivism, of science as religion is not opposed to science. In a certain sense, science is the belief system of modernity. So in that sense, if we're putting people into categories, if we took religion as a category, Pugin and Hübsch would be in one category, probably Labrouste in another. So the question of the person who hears echoes of Pugin is posing a really perceptive question.
Indeed. Then we have one final question. Do you see a connection between Saint-Simon and Hegel's view of progress? Does that speak to you?
Yeah, I think we could. Yeah, absolutely. They're totally parallel in date, and they are, I suppose, in fine-tuned terms, they're quite distinct. One could articulate many of the differences in, but I think more important than the differences is the commonality. And the commonality is that they are two of the most powerful thinkers, probably Hegel in the end, much more influential in the history of philosophy, perhaps Simone more effective in the world of actual applied policy making, at least in France, but also in Latin America. What they have in common is that their belief that history is not simply what happened, that it's happening according to a set of evolutionary laws the structure of historical change and a historical sequence can be understood, and ultimately even, this is the key to the concept of historicism, even identified as a trajectory into the future. So not only does the past follow a orderly sequence and dynamic that can be analyzed as law, so that history itself is becoming a kind of science, but also, like science, it might even have the capacity. This is why certain thinkers in the 20th century critique it so heavily. It could have a predictive aspect. Wonderful.
Professor Bergdoll, I want to just thank you once again for joining us and enlightening us on this topic this evening. It was very, very interesting, and I think everyone has enjoyed it quite a lot, judging from the questions that we received. I want to remind everyone that we will be having more programming very soon. Check the ICAA website for virtual events as well as in-person events now. It's all beginning to happen again now that everyone's coming out of quarantine. So we're very happy about that. And thank you to everyone who joined. We look forward to seeing everyone in the near future. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.